The envelope arrived on a Tuesday with no return address. Inside was a single photograph and a handwritten note in childish block letters. Check what your daughter is really doing. The photograph showed a woman who looked exactly like my daughter Margaret, except she was at least 10 years younger in the image, standing next to a much older man in front of a mansion. She was smiling, that same smile she gave me every morning at breakfast, the one that had convinced me she was the best thing that ever happened to our family. I stared at the photo for a very long time. My name is Patricia Halstead. I'm 64 years old. I've been married to Richard for 38 years. We have 3 biological children, all grown, all successful, all living far from home. We also have Margaret, whom we adopted when she was 18, fresh out of the foster care system. We thought we were saving her. We thought we were giving her a second chance. We didn't realize we were inviting a predator into our home. Margaret came to us through a social worker who called with an unusual request. I have a young woman, the social worker said, 18 years old, aging out of the system. She has no family, no prospects. She's intelligent, articulate, well-behaved. I think she would thrive in a stable home. I was sitting at the kitchen table when Richard took that call, and I watched his face soften in that way it always did when he was about to make a decision that would change our life. He nodded, listening, his mouth curving into a smile. "Let me discuss it with my wife," he said. We didn't need to discuss it much. We had the space, we had the means. We had been talking abstractly about adoption for years, feeling like we had so much love left to give after our own children had grown independent. Margaret seemed like an answer to that question. When we met her, she was everything the social worker had promised. Beautiful without being ostentatious, well-spoken, intelligent. She wore simple clothes and maintained careful posture. When we asked about her background, she didn't offer elaborate stories. She said her parents had died when she was young, that she'd bounced through the foster system without finding a permanent place, that she was determined to build a good life. "You've given me a chance," she said, looking at us with eyes that seemed impossibly grateful. "I won't waste it." She moved in on a Tuesday in September. Within a month, she was integrated into our household as if she'd always been there. She helped with cooking, she maintained the garden, she asked intelligent questions about our business. We owned a chain of specialty retail stores. She called us Mom and Dad with a natural ease that made us both feel like we'd finally completed something we didn't know was incomplete. Our biological children were less enthusiastic. "She's a stranger," my daughter Elizabeth said during a phone call. "You don't know anything about her." "She's 18 and has no one," I replied. "The social worker vetted her. We're giving her an opportunity." "That's lovely, Mom, but be careful. You're trusting someone you just met with access to your home and your finances." I dismissed the warning. Elizabeth had always been cynical, always seeing worst-case scenarios everywhere. Margaret was different. I could feel it. The first sign that something was wrong came 8 months into her living with us. Richard mentioned that Margaret had asked about updating his will. Just casually over breakfast, she'd wondered if he'd thought about what would happen to his assets if something unexpected occurred, whether he'd considered making provisions for people outside his immediate biological family. She said, Richard recounted, that it's something people often regret not doing, that if anything happened to us, she'd have nothing, no safety net. I felt a small chill at that moment, not because the question was unreasonable, it wasn't, but because of something in the way Richard described her asking it, the calculated casualness of it, the way she'd planted the seed in his mind. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her I'd think about it." I suggested, gently, that we not make any major legal changes right now, that Margaret is still settling in, that it was important to establish a foundation of trust before making documents that would tie our financial future to her welfare. Richard agreed, readily enough, though I could see something shift in him, a small shadow of doubt, or perhaps guilt, the guilt of someone considering excluding a family member from provisions they might deserve. That doubt was the wedge she needed. Over the next several months, Margaret worked on Richard with the patience of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. She'd mention, casually, how much she appreciated us, how she wanted to make sure we knew she wasn't taking anything for granted. She'd ask questions about our business operations, our investments, our properties. She'd research financial planning and mention articles she'd read about estate management. To someone paying attention, it would have been obvious. To Richard, it was love. I tried to tell him I was concerned. We had an argument about it one night when Margaret had gone to bed. I said something felt off. Richard said I was being paranoid, that Margaret was just trying to understand our world, to become part of the family properly. She's never asked us for money, he said. She hasn't been extravagant. She's been the perfect addition to our family. That's exactly what concerns me, I said. Then we have a problem, Richard replied, because I'm not going to treat her like a suspect just because you have a feeling. We didn't resolve that argument, not really. We just agreed not to talk about it, which meant we stopped communicating about anything involving Margaret at all. I noticed Richard becoming more distant from me, more protective of his relationship with Margaret. She had successfully, subtly driven a wedge between us. That's when I started watching. I'm not particularly good at deception. I've never been sneaky by nature, but desperation makes everyone capable of things they wouldn't normally do. I started paying attention to Margaret's activities. I noticed that she spent hours on her computer, but always closed the browser when I came near. I saw her taking phone calls outside, walking far down the driveway so no one could hear her conversations. One day, I found a credit card bill addressed to her, buried in a drawer in her room. She had a credit card we didn't know about, in her own name, registered to our address, but paid from an account I'd never seen before. Over the course of a month, she'd spent nearly $8,000. On what? I couldn't tell. The charges were vague. Various online services, restaurant charges in different cities, hotel stays. But there was something in particular that caught my attention. Charges from a genealogy website and multiple charges from a legal documentation service. Like she was researching something, building something. I started going through her things more systematically. I wasn't proud of it, but I was terrified. I found a folder, hidden in the lining of her suitcase, containing printouts. I took photographs of them with my phone, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone multiple times. They were newspaper clippings, all about elderly men or women who had recently passed away. They had names highlighted, dates of death circled. There were notes in Margaret's handwriting. Widowed 2015, assets circa $2 million. Single, 2 adult children, estranged. No siblings, large estate. What I was looking at was a list of targets. I felt my stomach turn. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it and went to my bedroom, locked the door, and called my daughter Elizabeth. I need you to listen to me very carefully, I said. Don't interrupt, just listen. I told her everything. The clippings, the hidden credit card, the way Margaret had isolated Richard from me, the questions about the will, the careful cultivation of gratitude and love that now felt calculated and false. You need to call the police, Elizabeth said immediately. For what? Finding newspaper clippings? That's not illegal. Having a credit card isn't illegal. Asking about wills isn't illegal. Mom, that's not the point. She's clearly dangerous. I know she's dangerous, I said, my voice cracking, but I need proof. I need something concrete before I blow up my marriage, destroy Richard's faith in his own judgment, and involve law enforcement in something I don't fully understand yet. Elizabeth wanted to argue, but she understood. So instead, I did something I should have done months earlier. I hired a private investigator. His name was Michael Torres, and when I met him in a coffee shop far from our neighborhood, he listened to my story without judgment. He didn't think I was crazy for being concerned about Margaret. He didn't think I was unreasonable. He simply asked me what I needed him to find out. Everything, I said, about Margaret, before she came to us, where she came from, her real history, who she really is. Michael was efficient and discreet. It took him 3 weeks to compile his report. When we met again, he handed me a folder that felt impossibly heavy for its size. Your Margaret doesn't exist, Michael said simply. What do you mean? Her social worker, the one who arranged the adoption, was playing a role. I traced her background. She's not actually a social worker. Her name isn't even what she claimed it was. She's part of a larger network. My hands were shaking. A network of what? Predators, Michael said. They target elderly and middle-aged couples who have disposable income but limited family support. They place a young woman in the home, always attractive, always grateful, always perfect. The setup is simple. The placed woman ingratiates herself, builds trust, particularly with one member of the couple, usually the one who makes major decisions about finances. And then? I knew the answer, but I needed to hear him say it. And then they execute whatever plan they've developed. It could be gradual financial theft. It could be influence over wills and trusts. It could be isolation leading to institutionalization of the targeted person. In extreme cases, he paused, it could be much worse. I thought about the photographs in Margaret's hidden folder, the highlighted names, the notes about assets and family situations. How extreme? I asked. I won't speculate, but I'll say that there have been cases where placed individuals have been present at deaths that were initially ruled as natural causes, but upon investigation showed signs of foul play. I couldn't breathe. I thought I might vomit. Your daughter Margaret isn't her real name, Michael continued. Her real name is Melissa Crane. She was born and raised in Oregon. Her mother was also involved in similar scams. Melissa was brought into the family business when she was 16. She's currently 32 years old, which means she's been doing this for 16 years. 16 years, I repeated numbly. Her methods have evolved over time. Initially, she was part of a theft operation, stealing directly from the couple she placed with. But about 8 years ago, her targets changed. She started targeting couples specifically for their estate value, wealthy individuals with limited family involvement. Like us, I said. Exactly like you. She's been profiling targets for 2 years before she actually placed herself. She knew about your business. She knew about your properties. She knew about your assets. She even knew about the estrangement between your biological children and your desire to adopt. How? I felt violated in a way that was almost physical. Your social media, Richard's old website for the business, public records, property registrations. People leave trails everywhere, Patricia. For someone who knows how to look, your whole life is readable. I asked Michael to continue, though part of me wanted to stop hearing, to go back to the comfortable belief that Margaret was who she seemed. Michael opened his folder and laid out documents. There were photographs of Margaret with different names, different families, different identities. She'd done this 17 times. 17 families. Some placements had lasted only months before something had made her flee or forced her to the next target, but some had lasted years. In one case, Michael said, quietly, showing me a news article, a man in his 70s was declared incompetent and placed under her guardianship while she was living in his home as an adopted daughter. She had him institutionalized 6 months later. He died 18 months after that, and she inherited approximately $1.8 million. Was she charged? The family tried to prosecute, but by the time they realized something was wrong, Melissa had already disappeared. She was long gone by the time they could build a case. I looked at all the photographs, all the evidence of Margaret's repeated cycle of deception, and I realized something horrifying. I didn't know whether she had killed anyone. I didn't know if she was capable of it, and I didn't know what she was planning for Richard. What do I do? I asked Michael. That depends on what you want. You could go to the police now with what you have. They'd likely bring her in for questioning, but without more concrete evidence of an active crime, they might not be able to hold her. She'd flee, and you'd have warned her. She'd just move on to the next target. Or we gather evidence of what she's actually planning. We set up cameras. We monitor communications. We give law enforcement something undeniable. But that requires you to keep her in your home while we do it. It requires you to keep her trusting. It requires you to act normally around her while knowing exactly what she is. I looked at the photograph of Margaret from the newspaper clipping, frozen in her smile, and I made a decision. I was going to catch her. I was going to document everything, and I was going to make sure she never could hurt another family the way she was planning to hurt mine. The first thing I did was talk to Richard, but not about Margaret. I talked about us. I said I'd been feeling distant, that I wanted to reconnect, that I thought we should go to couples counseling. Richard was surprised but agreed readily. He felt the distance too, though he didn't understand the cause. We started seeing Dr. Elizabeth Morrison every other week. In those sessions, with a professional mediator present, I began the careful work of rebuilding my relationship with Richard without telling him the truth. I was kind to him, I was present, I was intentionally intimate and loving in ways I hadn't been since Margaret arrived. Slowly, he began to return to me. The distance between us decreased, the wall that Margaret had built began to crumble. The second thing I did was contact Michael, and we planned the technical aspects of my surveillance. I gave him access to our home when Margaret was out, and he installed cameras in strategic locations: her bedroom, the office where financial documents were kept, the kitchen. The cameras were small, discreet, and they transmitted to a server I accessed through my personal computer, which I kept password protected and separate from the household devices. The third thing was harder. I had to continue living with Margaret as if nothing had changed. I had to be mom to her, the loving adoptive parent, while knowing that she was a predatory professional looking for opportunities to harm us. It was one of the most difficult things I've ever done. I watched the surveillance feeds carefully. I began documenting Margaret's activities. She continued asking Richard subtle questions about estate planning. She'd bring up scenarios about what would happen to her, if something happened to him, if I died first. How important it was to have a will that protected adopted children. The more I listened to the recordings, the more I understood her strategy. She was creating a narrative in Richard's mind that he was being unfair to her, that proper love for his adopted daughter meant providing for her in the same way he would his biological children. It was sophisticated psychological manipulation, and it was working. One evening, I found her in Richard's office, photographing documents. My heart jumped into my throat. She was holding his insurance policies, his investment accounts, his property deeds, all documented, all photographed with her phone. She didn't know about the camera positioned in the corner, capturing everything. I knocked on the doorframe, and she turned with a smile, quickly putting the documents back. "I was just looking at something Richard was showing me," she said smoothly. "Estate information. I wanted to understand how these things work." "Of course," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. "That's smart. Financial literacy is important." That night, I called Michael and told him I had evidence of her gathering information. "This is it," I said. "This is where we go to the police." "Not yet," Michael advised. "Having photographs of documents isn't a crime if she had permission to be there. We need her asking for access, or better yet, we need her attempting to forge something. We need an active crime." "How long?" "Not long. Someone like this doesn't have patience. She's been here 8 months. She'll escalate soon." He was right. 2 days later, Margaret asked if I wanted to have lunch with her, just the two of us. She chose a restaurant far from our home, on the other side of the city. Over salad, she told me that she'd noticed tension between Richard and me, and she wanted me to know that it wasn't her intention to create problems in our marriage. She said she sometimes worried that Richard was spending too much time thinking about her future and not enough time on our relationship. And then she said something that made every cell in my body want to commit violence. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, "that maybe I should leave. Start my own life somewhere. I don't want to be a burden on your marriage." It was a manipulation tactic, and I recognized it immediately. She wanted me to convince her to stay, to become emotionally invested in her remaining part of our family, to be grateful for her selflessness. It was a trap. "That might be best," I said calmly. "You're right. You should start your own life. You're a capable young woman." I watched her face as she processed this response, the one she hadn't expected. She'd calculated a scenario where I would beg her to stay, where I would convince Richard that she was essential to our family. Instead, I was agreeing. "Really?" she asked, her voice carefully confused. "Of course. We've given you the foundation. You should go build your own future now." I saw something flash across her face: anger, calculation, fear. She was reallocating her plans in real time, running through scenarios. Then she smiled, that perfect smile I'd come to hate. "You know, I've been thinking about it more, and I realize I don't want to leave. This is my family, and I think families should support each other in every way." "Of course they should," I agreed. She reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm so glad you understand that." What I understood was that she'd just revealed her true timeline. She was accelerating her plans. She was preparing to make her move, which meant I needed to accelerate mine. That evening, I called Michael. I told him I needed him to involve law enforcement, not to arrest her, but to prepare. I told him what had happened at lunch, what I suspected she was planning. "I need you to understand something," I said to him. "I think she might try to harm Richard, or me, or both of us." Michael didn't argue. He said he had a contact at the police department, a detective who specialized in financial crimes and elder fraud. He said he would arrange a meeting. We met the next day at a police station on the outskirts of the city. Detective Sarah Chen was younger than I expected, probably in her 40s, with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone who had seen enough human cruelty that nothing surprised her anymore. I told her everything: the surveillance footage, the documents Margaret had stolen, photographs of, the history of her previous targets, the way she'd isolated Richard from me, the psychological manipulation, the photograph folder with 17 victims highlighted. Detective Chen listened carefully, and when I finished, she said, "We can bring her in for questioning, but I want to be strategic about this. If she's as sophisticated as the information suggests, she'll have a cover story for everything. Her lawyer will advise her not to speak. We won't be able to hold her without more direct evidence of an act of crime." So what do? We wait for her to commit an act of crime, and we catch her in the act. Do you have her making any explicit demands? Any recordings of her actually trying to defraud you? Not yet, but I know she's about to escalate. Then we wait, we monitor, and when she moves, we move. I agreed. The waiting felt like torture. The waiting lasted 9 days. I continued going through my normal routines. I went to work, I attended my therapy sessions with Richard, I cooked meals and participated in family conversations. All the while, I was watching the surveillance footage obsessively, trying to predict when Margaret would make her move. And then one afternoon, I got a call from Richard. His voice was strange, formal in a way I hadn't heard in months. "Patricia," he said, "I need you to meet me at Dr. Morrison's office. It's important." My stomach went into freefall. Dr. Morrison was our marriage counselor. Why would Richard want to meet there? Had Margaret convinced him to divorce me? Was this her play, to separate him from me so she could gain full access to him? But no. When I arrived at the office, Richard looked confused and unhappy, and Margaret wasn't there. "Richard asked me to call you," Dr. Morrison said gently. "He told me something today that concerns me, and I think it's important that all 3 of us talk about it." Richard looked at his hands. "I went to my doctor yesterday for a routine checkup," he said. "He mentioned that my cognitive function seemed slower than my last visit. He asked if I'd been under stress or if I'd noticed any changes in my memory or thinking." "I haven't noticed anything," I said. "Exactly," Richard replied. "I haven't noticed anything," which made me think about what Margaret has been saying, about how I'm getting older, how I need to be prepared for mental decline, how it's important to have financial arrangements that would protect the family if something happened to my cognitive abilities. Oh my God, she was building a narrative of decline. "Richard," I said carefully, "has something happened that made you think there's a problem?" "No," he said, "which is what concerns me. Margaret brought up a geriatric specialist she found. She said it would be good for me to get evaluated, to have a baseline, so that if there were changes, we'd have documentation of when they started." "That's not unreasonable," Dr. Morrison offered. "It's actually good preventative medicine. Many people do that." The thing is, Richard continued, Margaret already made an appointment for me. She booked it without asking. She did it on the computer in my office. I found the confirmation email in my inbox. I felt rage and cold certainty settle in my stomach. She was fabricating evidence of decline. She was building the infrastructure to have him declared incompetent. Richard, I said carefully, has something happened that made you think there's a problem? No, he said, which is what concerns me. Margaret brought up a geriatric specialist she found. She said it would be good for me to get evaluated, to have a baseline, so that if there were changes, we'd have documentation of when they started. That's not unreasonable, Dr. Morrison offered. It's actually good preventative medicine. Many people do that. The thing is, Richard continued, Margaret already made an appointment for me. She booked it without asking. She did it on the computer in my office. I found the confirmation email in my inbox. I felt rage and cold certainty settle in my stomach. She was fabricating evidence of decline. She was building the infrastructure to have him declared incompetent. I'm concerned, Richard said, that maybe I should cancel the appointment, that maybe he paused, struggling, that maybe she's not who I think she is. I looked at him, and I saw the moment his trust finally cracked. I saw him beginning to understand that the person he'd welcomed into our family wasn't a lost girl needing love. She was a predator. I think, Dr. Morrison said carefully, that before you make any decisions, you should all sit down and discuss this, together. No, I said. Richard, before that happens, I need to tell you something. And I told him everything. He didn't believe me at first. He wanted to believe Margaret. His brain was still trying to convince itself that the narrative he'd constructed was correct, that he'd saved a lost girl, that she was grateful, that she was part of our family. But then I showed him the surveillance footage. I showed him the photographs she'd taken of our financial documents. I played the recording of her manipulative conversation with me at lunch. I showed him the folder Michael had compiled with her history, her previous victims, her pattern of deception. Watching Richard process this information was like watching someone's soul break in real time. I've been so stupid, he said. No, I said. You've been kind. There's a difference. Predators exploit kindness. That's not stupidity. That's being human. But he was devastated in a way I'd never seen before. The man who prided himself on his judgment, who had built a successful business through careful decision-making, had been thoroughly manipulated by a woman who had trained her entire life to be invisible inside families. We called Detective Chen. I told her we were ready. We had the evidence, we had the narrative, and we were ready to confront Margaret. Here's what we're going to do, Detective Chen said. We're going to bring her in for questioning regarding the identity fraud and financial investigation. We don't tell her about the surveillance. We don't tell her about Michael's investigation. We let her think we only know about her real name and basic background. And then we let her incriminate herself. Someone like her, when confronted with evidence, has a script. She'll try to talk her way out. And in talking, she'll likely confess to more than we could prove otherwise. Margaret was brought in for questioning on a Thursday afternoon. She was dressed beautifully, composed, ready for her role. She was confused when the police arrived at our door. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice small and frightened, the perfect performance of an innocent person. I watched from the kitchen as they read her rights and explained that there were questions about her identity and background that needed to be cleared up. "Of course," she said, "there must be a mistake. I've been nothing but honest." The interrogation room was visible through a one-way window. Detective Chen sat across from Margaret with a stack of documents. Behind her, Detective Kim maintained a silent, intimidating presence. "Your real name is Melissa Crane," Detective Chen said, not as a question. Margaret's composure flickered for just a moment, like a light bulb dimming. "I don't know what you're talking about. My name is Margaret Halstead." "No, it's not," Detective Chen replied. "You were born Melissa Crane on March 15, 1992, in Portland, Oregon. Your mother is Patricia Crane, also known as Sylvia Peters, also known as Maria Santos. You have a criminal history of identity fraud, financial exploitation, and—" Detective Chen paused. potentially more. Melissa maintained her denial, but I could see the calculation in her eyes. She was running through scenarios, assessing how much they knew, determining her best exit strategy. "We have evidence," Detective Chen continued, "of you entering homes as an adopted family member, gaining access to financial documents and systems, and systematically exploiting elderly and middle-aged couples." "That's absurd," Melissa said. "I've never done anything like that." "We have documentation of 17 cases," Detective Chen said. "In one case, a 72-year-old man was declared incompetent while you were living in his home. He was institutionalized for 18 months before dying. His family contested your inheritance, but by then you'd already transferred the funds and disappeared." "That has nothing to do with me." "It does, because we have photographs of you with that man taken 2 years before his death. We have documentation showing you were the beneficiary of his will, a will that was written during the period when you were living in his home." I watched through the one-way glass as Melissa's mask began to slip. The careful young woman was being replaced by something harder, colder, more predatory. "I want a lawyer," she said. "That's your right," Detective Chen replied. "But before you do that, I want you to understand what we have. We have surveillance footage from the Halstead home. We have recordings of your conversations about financial planning, about estate management, about securing positions of power over their assets. We have documentation of you attempting to arrange a fraudulent psychiatric evaluation for Richard Halstead. We have 17 cases in your file, Melissa, 17 families. And we're investigating 4 more where suspicious deaths occurred after your departures." I saw something happen in Melissa's face. I saw her understanding that this wasn't like the other times. This time, they had everything. "I want a lawyer," she repeated, and this time her voice was smaller. Detective Chen nodded. "That's your right." Melissa was formally charged with fraud, identity theft, elder exploitation, and attempt to commit guardianship fraud. She was held without bail pending trial, as she was deemed a flight risk with a history of evading detection by establishing false identities. The trial took 3 months to prepare. The prosecution built a meticulous case using surveillance footage, financial records, psychological testimony, and testimony from previous victims. The case became a landmark in elder fraud prosecution, attracting media attention and legal scrutiny. Through it all, Richard and I had to rebuild our marriage and our lives. It was harder than I expected. The betrayal had affected him deeply. He blamed himself for being manipulated. I had to help him understand that he wasn't the first or the last person to be fooled by someone whose sole purpose in life was to deceive. In the trial itself, I testified about what I'd observed, what I documented, and how I'd come to understand Margaret's true nature. Previous victims testified about their experiences. Detectives explained the patterns of behavior, and finally, Melissa herself took the stand in her own defense. She tried to paint a narrative of a traumatized woman who had been victimized by a controlling adoptive family. She claimed that the surveillance footage was evidence of paranoia and abuse. She suggested that her previous placements had ended for innocent reasons. She was good. She was very, very good. But the evidence was better. The jury deliberated for 4 days. When they returned, they found her guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 12 years in federal prison for fraud and elder exploitation, with potential additional charges related to the suspicious deaths being investigated by another jurisdiction. As the officers led her out of the courtroom, she made eye contact with me. And for just a second, I saw the real Melissa Crane underneath the masks. A woman who had spent her entire life learning to be everything people wanted her to be, who had no identity of her own anymore, who was nothing but a collection of performances designed to exploit human kindness. I felt sad for her, even as I felt relieved to be free of her. It's been 3 years since Melissa was convicted. Our life has gradually returned to something resembling normal. Richard and I are stronger, having survived the test of deception and come out the other side. We've actually become closer through the process, united by trauma, bound by having navigated through something that could have destroyed us. I've become an advocate for elder protection and financial fraud awareness. I speak at community centers and senior groups about recognizing red flags, about the methods that predators use, about the importance of maintaining financial independence and not fully trusting anyone with complete access to vulnerable family members. Michael Torres and I remain in touch. He told me that since my case gained media attention, he's had 10 additional families contact him, suspecting similar situations with placed individuals in their homes. 3 of those cases were legitimate fraud situations that have since been prosecuted. The other victims from Melissa's other cons have found community in each other. A man in Connecticut who had been slowly poisoned came forward. His family pushed for additional charges related to the attempt on his life. The investigation is ongoing. Melissa maintains her innocence from prison and has filed multiple appeals. Her lawyer argues that she was a traumatized young woman trying to survive, that the evidence is circumstantial, that I had a vendetta against her. The appeals have all been denied. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those years when she lived in our home. I think about the moments when I second-guessed my instincts, when I wondered if I was being paranoid or unfair. I think about how close we came to not discovering what she was, and I understand that we got extraordinarily lucky. Most people don't. Most families don't have a daughter who insists they investigate. Most people don't have access to private investigators and police detective contacts. Most people let the predators succeed. So I talk about it, and I write about it, and I try to make sure that what happened to us becomes a cautionary tale rather than a repeated tragedy. I try to make sure that other families recognize the signs before it's too late. Because the hardest lesson I learned is that evil doesn't always look evil. Sometimes it looks like a grateful young woman who calls you mom. Sometimes it looks like kindness. Sometimes it looks like the answer to a question you didn't know you were asking. And sometimes the only way to survive it is to pay attention to the small voice inside that says something is wrong, even when everyone else, especially the person you love most, is telling you to ignore it. I didn't ignore it, and so my family survived. Not unchanged, not unchallenged, but alive and whole. That's more than Melissa planned for, and I'll never stop being grateful for that.